Okay, so we're in book 5 now. We've looked at all these other virtues, these Aristotelian virtues. We didn't look at all of them in as much depth as I would have liked, but we got to look at several of them and explore, who would they apply to, what goes into them. And now we come to what's probably the most important virtue of all, which is justice. And Aristotle devotes a whole book to this. Why does he give a whole book to justice? Well, there's a couple of reasons that we'll see. And this is a good place to start with, this notion of justice being an ambiguous term. Some of the translations that you see of Aristotle call this an equivocal term. But ambiguous is probably a word that you're more used to. You're all familiar with something that somebody says to you being ambiguous, or somebody saying that what you're saying is ambiguous. You'll have some general notion of what it means to talk about ambiguity. And that applies to this question that we started asking at the beginning with Plato: what is justice? You remember the Republic was about that whole question: what is justice? First they started out with, well, justice is being good to your friends and being bad to your enemies. There turned out to be a few problems with that. Although you notice that coming back up again here, right, with reciprocity. Then Thrasymachus came out with this very radical view: justice is the interest of the stronger, or the advantage of the stronger. And we looked at some problems with that. And then eventually we got to this notion of justice as being sort of balancing within your soul. And we thought in terms of our appetites, this spirited element, and reason. Aristotle's going to ask this question again, and every important thinker in ethics and political philosophy, and in quite a few of your other fields that you guys are studying, criminal justice majors, constantly having to rethink this question of what is justice. Business majors, you might not necessarily think of this, but when you're trying to determine what's fair, you're asking the question: what is justice? There's a lot of majors where it won't come up as immediately as that, but design majors, how much time should you give to one particular project, or later on, how much time should you give to one particular client as opposed to another client? That's a question of justice. That's a question of fairness, right? If any of you ever become teachers, which I imagine some of you will, some may end up finding an avocation for teaching K through 12, and some of you may become college professors someday. You'll be posed with questions of justice. It's not going to come out like that. You're not going to say to yourself, what would the just thing to be in this case? But you'll ask yourself things like, should I follow through on this obligation? What would be fair here? Because you're constantly going to have problems coming up and having to figure out how you should allocate your scarce amounts of time and attention. What counts as fair when you're dealing with students? Should you give one student who seems to need the attention much more attention and leave out the other students? These are all sort of questions concerned with justice. Actually, some of you have exercised leadership roles, RAs. Many of you have ever been in charge of a club, or what else would be like that in college? Club officers, RAs. Anything else that comes to mind? As leadership positions for you guys? Team captains, or coordinators or things like that, right? Those involve justice as well, because you're having to determine who gets what and how to decide cases. So this is a really important question, and Aristotle is going to take a different tack than Plato did, or Thrasymachus, or Polemarchus. He's not going to have one single answer. That's why he says this is an ambiguous term. When you say something is ambiguous, you're saying it has more than one meaning. So take an ambiguous word in English, for example, seal. What does that word mean? What's the one single meaning of seal? Or is there one single meaning? How many meanings can you think of? When I say the word seal, what came to your mind first? Yeah. Yeah, the one that, sometimes it's in the circus, who plays the horns, and what do they eat like other animals. I don't remember exactly what, but they're actually kind of neat. They look cute. So that's one meaning. What's another meaning? Yeah.
Like a seal from like the government or.
Oh yeah, like with things that they emboss things with. Yeah. Every state has one. A lot of counties have them. You see it like on a podium. The president gets up and gives a talk. There's always the presidential seal. Okay, so that's another one. So we've got two meanings. Yeah.
Like the seal that keeps somebody closed?
Yeah, you can talk about sealing an envelope. When I was a kid, they had this thing called Seal-A-Meal, which was, this is before they had Ziploc bags, believe it or not. It was this gigantic thing that you would have these bags, sort of like, the kind of bags that we're used to now, freezer bags. And you'd put your food in it, and then you'd put it into the Seal-A-Meal thing, and you'd push it down, and the heating element in it would melt the plastic, and now you'd have a sealed bag. And then Ziploc came out, and that was the end of that. But they called it Seal-A-Meal because you were putting a seal on that meal. So already we have three different meanings. That means that the term is ambiguous. Now, if I say I saw a seal in the zoo, which seal are you thinking of? Yeah, right. If I say President Obama gave a speech and I could see the seal, which one are you thinking of? You're thinking of thing, like a crest, some sort of emblem. If I say somebody needs to fix that seal on the roof, you don't think there's an animal up there, right? That has to be fixed. You think of some sort of coating or something, closing something off. So you know how to handle ambiguity when it's terms that you're familiar with. Now notice with seal, those meanings are pretty far apart from each other. They're really easy to tell apart, right? When it comes to justice, the meanings are closer together. So it's harder to tell them apart. Aristotle is going to distinguish a number of different kinds of justice. It's really easy to mix those up. And this is why we get into all sorts of confusions, and this is why we get into arguments as well about what's right and what's wrong. Oftentimes, Aristotle says, he doesn't say this so much in this book, but in other parts of his works, in Politics, for example. He says a lot of times when we're arguing about justice, what we don't realize is each of us is partly right and partly wrong. So think of this as the whole of something. Person A is getting this amount, person B is getting this amount. They agree on this part right here. And person A thinks that by getting this portion, he or she actually knows exactly what justice is. Person B is actually seeing a side of that the other person isn't seeing. And of course, they're typically also saying, yeah, you're completely wrong too. You don't know what you're talking about. Only this is justice. And Aristotle says, well, if that's what's going on, you're going to end up in a lot of conflicts and a lot of disagreements with each other. The best thing is to actually grasp all of it. And the only way that you can really adequately do that is by taking a look at it and going through and seeing what falls under justice, what actually is included and what's not. There's a few other things I'd like to sort of point out, just by comparison with this. There's other terms that we use that are like this too, I think. For example, freedom. Does freedom always mean exactly the same thing? There are multiple senses to this too, aren't there? It's also an ambiguous term. Your freedom that you enjoyed as a kid, freedom from worry, you probably don't enjoy anymore, do you? Because you're in charge of your own life and that's certain anxieties. Do you have other freedoms that you didn't have as a kid? Precisely why you're subjected to anxieties, because you actually get to decide where you're going to live, what you're going to do, what you're going to eat, who you're going to hang out with, all these things, whether you're going to go to class or not. You probably didn't feel like you had much of a choice about that back when you were a kid, did you? Unless some of you were juvenile delinquents, which I highly doubt. Well, so that means freedom has different senses. There's other meanings of freedom that you might not really think about or come across until later on, when you encounter situations where you're unfree. I think I may have mentioned this example of a friend of mine she was considerably older than me, and she'd been a hippie in the 1960s and 1970s, and that meant a certain kind of lifestyle, right? Being very free, not tying yourself down with relationships, with a job that you were going to stick to forever, rising in a career, owning a house, having a mortgage, all that sort of stuff. Not letting the man get you down, that sort of business, right? You're all familiar with that. There's still people living like that today. And she was in her 40s, and she owned a cafe. That's how I knew her. And she said something really interesting one day while I was working there. The cafe was struggling, and businesses are hard to start. There are a lot of work and a lot of toil and a lot of headaches. And she looked at herself. She said, I never finished college, and so I don't have a degree. I never saved any money because I just did whatever I wanted. Like she, backpacked across. She backpacked all the way through Mexico down to Peru. Well, not all of us have those sort of adventures, but those come with a kind of cost. So she enjoyed a massive amount of freedom in one sense. Then later on, she said, I look at all my friends who I thought were squares. That was the word that they used back then, right? For people who did what you guys do. Stayed in school, planned to get a job, probably get married, settle down, rise in your career. And she said to me, I'm so unfree now because they've got the things that they committed to, that they invested in. They have jobs, they have college degrees, they have families. I've got nothing except for this business. And this is not even doing that well. I feel, and I can tell how unfree I am. Well, I think she was talking about freedom in a different sense, don't you? What do you think? There's different meanings to freedom. Here's another word that might, some of you are art majors, design majors, fashion majors. Beauty. I'm sure all of you have given some thought to what is the definition of beauty, and you struggled with that and probably came to the conclusion that there isn't one single definition. Now, I want to point one other thing out too about this ambiguity. The fact that these don't have a strict one single definition that you can pin everything on, does that mean everything's up for grabs? Sometimes we talk like that, don't we? That beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Is that really true, that beauty is purely in the eye of the beholder, that there are no norms to it whatsoever? Those of you who are art or design or fashion majors, or anybody else who's interested in art, music, literature, does anything go whatsoever? Why not? That's a little hard to answer, isn't it? Why not? Could you come up with multiple meanings of beauty? Do you think? If we sat down and we went through, which we're not going to do because we don't have time, but if we sat down, could you come up with 6 or 7 different overlapping definitions? Why some things are, this is not beautiful. It's not poorly designed, but I wouldn't call this great product design. Would you? This could probably be, much more attractive. Some things that you buy a bottle of water in are more attractive to the eye. If you knew definitions, you could explain why. Well, it's going to be that way with justice. When we get into arguments about what is justice, we want to be able to tell somebody, well, here's what justice is. And then if they say to us, oh, so that's all there is to it? If we're Aristotle, we'd say, no, there's more to it than that. This is one kind of justice. So today what we're going to do is explore these different kinds of justice. So let's start out looking at legal justice. What does legal justice mean for Aristotle? One way of thinking about this right off the bat is following an somebody is a law-abiding person, do they break the laws? No. If somebody's a lawbreaker, well, they probably honor some of the laws, because I don't think you could possibly break every single law that we've got on the books, could you? I mean, it would just boggle the mind, the efforts that you would have to go through to do that. But, you know, what separates lawbreakers from law-abiding people, law-abiding citizens? Is it just the fact that one breaks the law and one doesn't break the law? Or is there more to it than that? What do you guys think? Yeah.
You go lawbreaker, usually somebody's like a lawbreaker. I think it's somebody that's intentionally breaking the law, or somebody that's following the law.
That's
usually going out of their way to try and not break the law.
That's an important distinction. Aristotle does talk about, cases of ignorance, and there's probably a lot of laws that it's in our society. We've got so many of them. The CJ majors probably know more about this, right? You guys are better off a little bit, marginally.
A little bit.
There's probably some that we might end up breaking, not realizing it. And there's all sorts of rules about copyright, fair use. I can't even say that I fully have my head around what constitutes fair use inside and out. And I'm somebody who uses documents for a living. That's different than saying, okay, I know what the law is. Screw the law. I'm going to do what I want, or I'm going to break this law just because it's there. I'm a rebel, or something like that. But what about being law-abiding? Is it enough just to not break the law? To happen not to break the law? Yeah.
I think it's about knowing why the laws are in place and
Okay.
doing it for that reason, because it's for the overall good and it's more respecting the overall good.
I think you're right, and I think that coincides well with what Aristotle says about the function of law. It's supposed to promote the good of the whole, the common good. Do laws always do that? They can be badly changed. Sometimes the laws can be unjust. They can favor one group in society over another. Famous example that I brought up before is, when Martin Luther King was protesting. All these other people were marching. Those of you who've read a letter from the Birmingham jail, which I recommend that you read, because it's a really important piece of American literature. It's a good piece of political philosophy, too. He's saying, I have to respond to the fact that people are saying I'm a hypocrite because I want the laws to be enforced about equality of opportunity and, education, all those sorts of things. And yet I'm breaking the law. That's why I'm in jail. They arrested me and all these other people for breaking the law against public gatherings without a permit. And so he has to explain himself. Why is it okay for me to break the law in this case, but want everyone else to follow the laws? Because, there is a genuine contradiction there, isn't there? And he says, well, those laws are unjust laws. They're not there for the common good. You can distinguish between just and unjust laws. And he brings in Thomas Aquinas and Augustine to make sense of this. Let's assume that the laws are set up well in society. To understand, I think you're right, to have some sort of conception of why the laws are there, what the purpose of the laws is, seems to me to be involved in legal justice. Let's think for a minute about some of the other things that he's saying about legal justice. He says that the laws, if they're set up well, if you have a society where the laws are doing their job, they command us to do things that are in accordance with virtue, and they forbid us to do things that fall under the vices. And so they don't come right out and say, you have to be a virtuous person, you have to be a vicious person, but they promote virtuous behavior, and they tend to curb vicious behavior by punishing the one and sanctioning or rewarding the other. So he has some examples that we probably can't relate to that well in our society. Like, for instance, there were laws in ancient Greece. You had city-states, and if you were a man and you had a little bit of property at that time, you had to fight in the army up to a certain age. And what was particularly important about that was when they sent you out to battle, you didn't throw your shield away and take off and say, this isn't for me. Everyone needed to actually stand up for their city and fight. That was one of the things Aristotle sees as courage, right? Battlefield courage. So the laws, there were actually laws on the book that had to do with things like you're not allowed to throw away your shield. Why? Because your shield was a kind of important investment. Just like if you're in the military today, the one thing you don't lose track of is your weapon that's been issued to you. You get in a lot of trouble if you lose your weapon, right? They want to know why. So there were laws about that, and what Aristotle says is that's requiring courageous actions, and it's forbidding cowardly actions. And then he brings up another one that I think maybe we can relate to a little bit better. He says the laws require temperate actions and forbid intemperate actions. And he uses the example of adultery. Now, in our time, adultery in most states is no longer illegal. It used to be illegal. It used to be you could actually have fines, punishments, jail time for being an adulterer, not just getting divorced or some other thing like that. You could actually face sanctions. In the military, it's still a crime to commit adultery. And in some societies, it can get you killed to have sex, once you're married, to have sex outside of the marriage bond or to seduce somebody else's spouse can have very high sanctions. It was a problem in Aristotle's time too. He says the laws forbid adultery, and by doing that they're promoting temperance and they're trying to curb intemperance. We would probably expand it more to, when you see adultery, think sexual cheating, right? You don't necessarily, in our society, you have to be married. We recognize, I think, most of us, right, that if you're in a monogamous relationship with somebody else, you generally ought to be monogamous. Stay with that person. If you want to leave that relationship, you probably should tell them ahead of time before you start doing anything. If they do that, if they do something that's not on the up and up, you kind of get upset about that, don't you? If you see somebody else cheating on somebody else, that bothers you, I think. It also means that you shouldn't go and seduce other people out of monogamous relationships, and they shouldn't, seduce your partner. So, that would fall under temperance. He says the laws also require good-tempered actions, or mild actions, or things that have to do with anger. What do we do? What do we tend to do when we're angry with people? That could get us in trouble. Sometimes we hit them. The laws actually forbid that, don't they? Generally, just because somebody looked at you the wrong way, you can't go up and smack them. People do, but then the cops come and take them away, right? You can't get into an argument with somebody and then settle it by punching them out and not face consequences. You can do it, but that would be a vicious action. He also talks about not slandering the other person. The word that he uses in Greek is literally not to say bad things about them. That's something we're tempted to do when we're angry too, isn't it? And this would cover like libel or slander or things like that. So here's something to think about. Would you say that our laws, the laws that we have in our society, still fulfill this function of promoting virtue and curbing vice? Think to the virtues that you've been studying. Do the laws require you to be a temperate person? The laws that we have on the books.
Certain areas.
Like what?
Well, like you mentioned, violence is strictly prohibited.
But that's not a matter of temperance. Temperance has to do with physical pleasure.
Are you referring to specifically like the temperance? So like drinking maybe? So like you're only allowed to drink to a certain limit before you pretty much would go to jail for drinking and driving?
Well, if you drive. I mean, you can stumble home.
Well, Even that's public drunkenness.
You
I
notice
think,
though, they've actually, yeah, you're right, public drunkenness.
Public intoxication.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's how you call it.
and one thing that's really interesting to note is a lot of these laws about like public intoxication, even the DUI laws, those are fairly recent. Just 2 generations ago, a lot of those were not on the books. Yeah.
I'm like outlawing certain drugs.
Yeah, I think that would probably be a good instance, making certain drugs illegal and then making others controlled substances, like, you know, the stuff you buy at the pharmacy.
You know, some things like pharmacy can be messed up. It's easier.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, here's a great example, again, of something that we changed recently. It used to be you could buy all the cough syrup you wanted, right? When I was a kid, yeah, you could buy it by the case if you wanted. Why don't they let you do that now?
People use it for
You can
different
make
things.
some.
You can make meth with it, yeah. and generally, people who are buying cough syrup by the case are taking it and making meth with it.
You know the ID now, right?
Oh,
Even
yeah.
if you buy like a single one,
Yeah, now it's
you
now
gotta
it's
be
a
over 18. Yeah.
now it's a controlled substance essentially.
Yeah.
And so the law is curbing certain types of intemperance. Does the law, so you're right about intoxication, I think that covers that. What about eating? That's one of the main things intemperance is concerned with. Do the laws tell you how much you can eat or not eat or anything like that? So they don't cover that. What about sexual matters? The laws say,
Statutory laws.
statutory rape, yeah, it says the person has to be above a certain age before you can have sex with them. And there are people out there like arguing, the age of consent should be lower, you know. Some of them have bizarre conceptions of what the age of consent ought to be, yeah.
I guess, so they don't really tell you how much you can have it, but just who you can have it with. I don't think there's anything.
Like what? What would be an example?
You can't just go rape someone.
That would not only be a who, that would be a how as well, right?
Well, yeah.
There has to be consent, so that establishes a certain limit.
But I don't think they have laws against how much sex you can have.
Yeah, and you notice that there really aren't a lot of laws on the books anymore saying you can't go seduce somebody's spouse. Down in the South, they still have something called alienation of affection, which is a kind of weird way of saying if somebody comes in and screws up your marriage, you can actually sue them in civil court for monetary damages. Yeah.
I think they're wrong, but there's sodomy laws in like a lot of.
Which have to do with governing certain types of sexual practice, and most of them have been overturned recently as well. Yeah. So a lot of the laws aren't promoting the Aristotelian virtues. We have a different conception of law quite often. It's more like those are the rules of the game, and so long as you don't violate the rules, you're okay. Aristotle's working with a somewhat different conception of law. That's why I wanted to lead you through this to get you to see that. Let's think about a few other types of laws that do try to modify our behavior and arguably try to make us into better people. What about laws governing, say, domestic abuse? Again, a lot of this is fairly recent stuff too, right? You know? There's a 911 call, cops come, somebody says, we're having an argument, he hit me, he choked me, something like that. Take the guy away. More often, men on women. There's female on male abuse too, right?
Yeah, but especially in that instance, if it's like your significant other,
Yeah.
and it's time to go and press charges against that person, and like when they calm down after the heated argument, like,
Yeah.
oh no, I don't want to press charges, but the police have already come and taken them, you know?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. And this is very, very much by jurisdiction. Sometimes, sometimes it does depend on the person pressing charges, right? And then at other times the prosecutor says, I don't care if you're going to press charges. He's in the system now, I'm going to press charges. So it very much depends on your locale, doesn't it? I think. And on a lot of discretion. who's handling the case. If the police officer shows up on the scene and thinks, nothing really took place here, nobody's got any marks, maybe they don't take anybody to jail. Or maybe if, the police officer could be overzealous, everybody goes to jail, But the laws that we have on the books, are they trying to change behavior, or are they just operating sort of like guardrails? Don't go any further than this. I think that would depend on the place. And a lot of that would also depend on what sort of support system is set up for victims of abuse too, wouldn't it? Is there anybody there, like an advocate, to counsel them, to lead them through the process so they don't say, just recant and say, it was all a misunderstanding, which is a natural tendency. What else? Yeah.
I think it's not as much domestic violence as it is like, sexual assault, sexual abuse between like older men and younger kids. I don't know.
Well, there are definitely laws against that.
Yeah, and I think like what you were saying is the support. I think now we're seeing a lot more people come out because other people have come out and things.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting point. That quite often, one second, when some sort of, so here's the thing. Aristotle is pointing out, when he's talking about justice and injustice as virtues and vices, unjust people typically act unjustly. They don't just do it one time, made a mistake or something like that. It's part of their character. So they're going to be unjust in this way and then unjust in this way. Child abuse, sexual abuse, child molestation is a great example of that, because generally the child molester has a totally skewed view of reality where somehow they're the victim and the children are seducing them, and what they're doing is A-okay, and it's those authorities out there who are really out to get everybody else, and they're the bad guys. When I taught in Indiana State Prison, one of my friends who was teaching in another prison, he taught in a wing that was entirely sex crimes. So a lot of child molesters. And so we would teach these philosophy classes, and quite often there were child molesters mixed in with the general population. And sometimes you get kind of a weird vibe about a guy in your class who was always sort of challenging things and always wanted to sort of undermine things and try to take control of the classroom in a strange way. And I would always go and look people's cases up after the semester just to see what they've done. And the psychology of most murderers, pretty straightforward. They've done bad things, sometimes they regret it, sometimes they don't. The psychology of a child molester is much more tangled. And their sense of right and wrong is much more skewed. So Aristotle would say something like that. It's a clear instance of vice. They not only do bad things, they justify it. They say, oh no, I'm not doing bad things. As a matter of fact, you're doing bad things and interfering with me doing this. This friend of mine, he taught in an entire classroom composed of child molesters. He couldn't get anything done. It was like almost impossible to effectively teach. In part because of the dynamic that was going on there. And this, people who routinely commit injustice, who have unjust characters, will find other ways to be unjust when one form doesn't work out. They'll exacerbate it. This is why in sentencing, the motive of the person is often so important. How do we get onto this? It's kind of an interesting byway.
Talking about how now that people come out saying they're getting a lot more help because people are not as afraid to.
So quite often, injustices, and this isn't something Aristotle's saying, this is a very interesting point about moral psychology. Quite often people get away with doing wrong things. And they get away with it because other people make allowances for it. They enable it. They say, oh no, he didn't really mean it. It's just this one time. That's why Aristotle makes this big distinction that you notice between being an unjust person, being, actually, I'll put this on the board. I think this is very important to point out. So there's a difference between being unjust, committing injustice, and then committing other things like wrong or a mistake. These are words we use to translate this distinction that he makes. There's a certain point where he actually distinguishes between committing an unjust act, an act which clearly is wrong, and the person should be able to see that it's wrong. Now, they may not actually be unjust. They may have done it because somebody, forced them to do it, or they were ignorant at the time, or they found themselves unable to stand up to their appetites, but they're not completely unjust. The unjust person does those sort of things characteristically, habitually. You can rely on them to do it. And then there's committing something that is, in fact, wrong, that does harm or hurt somebody, but there's less intent. It has less to do with the person who's doing it, probably more to do with the circumstances. And then there's, just total mistakes. You didn't know that, you had no idea the gun was loaded. And accidentally went off and it went through the house and hit some bystander. You didn't intend that at all. That's not the same thing as committing injustice. Now, people who are habitually unjust, who have that vice, who are viciously unjust, will often coerce other people or take advantage of other people so as not to have to suffer punishment. And the punishment could be judicial punishment, the punishment could be social disapproval. They make other people out to be the bad guys. So, if we take domestic abuse, what's one of the things that abusers will often say about their victims?
They had it coming.
They had it coming, yeah. And then sometimes they'll go so far as to actually say, oh no, they're the abusive one. They hit me. When, it's the other way around. And you can almost always find somebody who will be willing to believe that, because quite often we don't want to believe bad things about people. So if to go to these sort of cases where somebody comes forward and then they say, this is hard to believe, but this person molested me, or this person beat the hell out of me, or this person stole this money from me, somebody who's a pillar of the community. And then other people start coming forward after that. It takes courage for that person to actually be able to do that. Because quite often that person has been committing on injustice for quite a while. They've been getting away with it. That's part of who they are. And they've got the reason why they're getting away with it. They're surrounded by all these people who are making excuses, who are covering up, who are enabling them, who are looking the other way. And getting those people to change their views on that, that's tough, isn't it? People don't want to hear that at first. Tell somebody that their cousin, their brother or sister is an embezzler, or abuses their spouse, or is a horrible disciplinarian with their kid. Quite often people don't want to hear that at first, and you'll be the bad guy. But then after the truth starts to come out, then that enables other people to start saying, yeah, that person committed injustice against me. And then after the picture starts to become more clear, you realize that the bad person, the aggressor, is really in this state. Not just, having done it once, having done something that's an unjust act. Not just, a mistake was made. Yeah.
Like, in regards to the case that you mentioned, like, for Penn State, like, a lot of those guys are...
Yeah.
What,
is that what you had in mind as Penn State?
That
guess,
and like,
no,
in general, there was like there was a succession of different cases that came up, and I think it's kind of like people are becoming less afraid
Yeah.
to voice the fact that they were molested.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of these big profile cases, I think it's kind of giving a voice for people that may not want to come out, or too scared, or they don't know there's help.
And that's a good thing, Aristotle would say. Yeah.
A a lot of them are 30, 40 years old now. The guys from Penn State. So if you think about it, at that time they didn't feel comfortable coming out
Yeah.
because of the way society would actually view them, not the person that committed the crime. And that's what's most interesting. I mean, I feel like it mentions, because you were talking about how laws have changed, or perception as well. Perception at that time, if that happened to them, sure, the guy would have been prosecuted, but they would have been scorned in their neighborhoods. Yeah, pretty much. Nobody would want to hang out with them and so forth. But now, I guess, since they came out saying that, and there were some younger occurrences with people now, I guess it's kind of more okay. Society's willing to help them rather than mark them.
Yeah, I think you're right. And an interesting corollary to that is if we're looking at domestic abuse, for a very long time it was just, there was no domestic abuse of women against men. Because you just simply didn't report that sort of thing. Because if you did, then you weren't a real man, right? So a lot of it wouldn't get reported. This is a problem with many underreported crimes, that the victims have a sense of shame, often played on by the aggressor. Let's go on. These are all really good comments and suggestions. When the laws have been made well, Aristotle thinks, they should actually steer us towards virtue and away from vice. Here's something I'd like you to think about, and I'm not going to explore this too much in this class session. Do you think the laws that we have in our society, do you think that you guys now know what the virtues and vices are. Do you think they're well set up to promote virtue and to try to steer people away from vice? Or do you think that they just produce maybe conformity in a certain way? What do you think? Or you could do a little introspection. When you think about the laws and your own attitude towards them, do you feel that the laws of your society, those virtues that you've recognized yourself as having, do you feel that those laws have shaped you into having those virtues? Do you think that they have steered you away from vices? Have the laws made you a less angry person? Or
I kind of feel like growing up is kind of when you develop a lot of your habits, and I don't think, as a child, you don't really think about the law. You know what people are telling you, your parents, your family, and stuff like that, what your friends are doing. I don't really think you start recognizing the law until you're older enough and have developed.
I think you're probably right. I mean, unless you are in extraordinary circumstances, probably. Wind up in the foster care system or something like that. You want to know why you ended up with this set of people rather than that set. Yeah, I think there's something to what you're saying. Does this make sense to the rest of you that now law means something more for you in guiding your behavior than it did, say, when you were 6, 10, 14? Again, if you were a juvenile delinquent, maybe 14, you'd already encountered the law quite a bit. But that's the case for you guys. Since that time, have the laws helped you to work on your virtues and get rid of vices? You didn't think of them in terms of virtues and vices. You may have just thought to yourself, wow, I got to get my anger under control. Or, man, I need to eat less. Or I need to exercise more, or stuff like that. Does the law actually affect that for you?
I was going to say, to a certain extent it does, not in terms of the examples that you just gave, but just in terms of making sure that you're not doing something that's wrong, like killing a person, those big kind of things, because it's also against the law, it's kind of feels like another reinforcer.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, with things like you were just, giving examples of, not at all.
Yeah.
They're kind of, they influence in certain respects, but they don't in others.
Yeah, I think you guys remember earlier on in the semester I put up something about, it was a quote from Martin Luther King, right? And he said, the law cannot make a man love me, We can't make a person behave lovingly towards me or to care about me or anything like that. It can make them not kill me though, and that's an achievement. So legal justice, it's justice. It's not justice in any full sense. And a lot of times people try to get themselves off the hook by saying, hey, I satisfied the law, I didn't break any laws, therefore I'm a good person, just as good as this guy over here, this woman over here. Who are you to judge me? I haven't violated any written norms. There's a lot more to being just than just not breaking the law. That's Aristotle's point. So this leads us to the next thing. We started talking about virtue. Aristotle says justice is also complete virtue, or the whole of virtue. And when you first read that, you might have said, "Wow, then why did you have me read all this other stuff about these other virtues? If justice is the one virtue that covers everything, why are we messing around with that? And why are we looking at all these other ones in depth? Courage? If courage is just a kind of justice, why not just look at justice? Temperance is just a kind of justice. Aristotle says that the fully just person, in a way, has all the virtues wrapped up in them. And he says this about a few other virtues as well. This is where we get to talking about the unity of the virtues. Justice requires the development of good character traits. So to be a fair person, be a just person, habitually requires that you develop some of the other virtues. Because if you think about this, this makes good sense. It would be difficult to be just if you're motivated by certain vices, wouldn't it? We talked about the greedy person, the stingy person. That person wants wealth too much, and they make themselves kind of a nuisance to other people and to their friends and to larger society by taking more than they get. Well, some unjust people or some greedy people are going to do bad things to get that money. They're going to break the norms of justice. One thing that Aristotle says about this, justice is complete virtue. So it's virtue. It covers all the other virtues, but it covers those virtues, as he says, in relation to others. So, what does this mean? This is as opposed to just in your own private affairs, as opposed to just dealing with things by yourself. And I think that this is kind of confusing. It's confusing not only for students studying it for the first time, it's still confusing for those of us that have been reading Aristotle for 10, 15 years in the Greek and keep going over this passage, because some of the stuff that he's saying doesn't seem to fit that well. Some of the virtues that we've looked at are already oriented towards others, aren't they? Like generosity. That's not about, it is a little bit about how you manage your money, and that's for you, but it's really about giving to other people, right? Are you generous if you give to yourself? What do we say about people who say, I'm going to give myself a present. I'm going to give myself a nice pick-me-up for the day. Do we look at them as being a generous person? No, they could give to somebody else, and then they'd actually be on the track to that. So I don't know if generosity or magnificence would necessarily fit under this that well. The virtues that have to do with ambition, they might not fit that so well either, because ambition is already in relation to other people, right? If I am ambitious, that means that I want to get power, position, prestige, those sorts of things, and those are always relational. If I'm going to get power, it has to be power from or power over you or other people. If I'm going to get prestige, that means somebody's got to be looking up to me, right? So I need some other people. So I don't think that it fits that. But there are some virtues that it does fit really well. It's one thing to be courageous for yourself, right? Bless you. And you guys have all experienced having to stand up for yourself against opposition, or having to face some sort of danger, or some adversity, some physical hardship, or having to overcome some fear that you had, like, we used public speaking as an example, but I'm willing to bet that, another great example, some people don't feel this sort of fear, but a lot of people have to sort of process through it, asking somebody out on a date for the first time, or even just calling somebody that you're interested in on the phone. I remember back in middle school and high school how tough that was at first, and then after a while it gets easier, right? If you're good, but if you don't do it at all, if you shy away from it, then that cowardice can take root, and then maybe you never do it. Or applying for a position that you're maybe not totally qualified for, but could grow into. That might scare some of you. What do you think? Or it could be a good position for you, but you don't have exactly what they're asking for. Maybe they'll chew you out for even asking them about it. But the more that you do it, the easier it gets, the more you develop a sort of disposition of courage. But that's for yourself. Are there cases where you have to be courageous for other people? Some of you mentioned some of these in your journal entries. When you talked about your own courage. What are some cases where you have to be courageous for another person?
Well, you have to defend them, in the sense that, in the physical sense, you might have to defend someone from being attacked or something. I personally never had to experience that, but also in the verbal sense, if someone is bringing that person down or saying bad things about them, you could be courageous and stand up for that person and defend their.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about, where somebody's being run down, unfairly attacked. Here's something to think about. People who are abusive, who are unjust, who habitually want to take more than their fair share, who want to subordinate others to them, to have power over them, to force them into things that they don't want. Those sort of people don't usually just do that. They also have a line. It's not really my fault. That person's the aggressor. A lot of times when people cheat, in relationships, they say, "Oh, the other person was cheating on me," or they were emotionally unavailable, so it's okay for me to cheat. Or you can come up with all these other sorts of things. So in the sphere that we live in, this public sphere, where we often, bless you, know something about each other's business. And Facebook has made it even more so like this, right? Because people can post all sorts of things about each other. It's quite often the case that things get misrepresented. A good person gets called a bad person. If you actually, one second, if you actually call a bad person on their bad activities, what's usually the response to you? You guys have all, I think, done that. What happens? They say, "Oh, you're right. Shouldn't have done that. I really need to reform my character." What's more often the response that you've encountered?
They usually get defensive.
Mm-hmm.
What you just said.
Yeah, and sometimes they attack you, and then sometimes their friends attack you, and pretty soon you're the bad guy for standing up for yourself, or for standing up for somebody else. So courage is really needed in social life. Courage to actually stand up for what's right and to defend other people. What were you going to say?
I was just thinking about, what about the profession of lawyers who, even if they know their clients are wrong and they're defending them, are they being just, or are they, because I know they're getting paid for it, but what if the client even tells them they're wrong and they still go defend them and they win the case?
That's an interesting case, because in our society, the way that we've set it up, our legal system, and it doesn't have to be set up this way, but we're stuck with this one. We have this adversarial system where the prosecutor's duty is not actually just to put people in prison or get findings of guilty, but to find the truth. The prosecutor's job is to do that. And the defending attorney is just supposed to look out for the interests of their client. And we say that they have a particular duty, even if their client is guilty, to give them the best defense possible. I think Aristotle would be willing to recognize that because we've got the system set up that way, we're stuck with it. So the defense attorney is not unjust by doing his or her job well, but they're not as just as they could be. I think he would say our system is not particularly well set up. And so that, you know, there can be a lot of cases where your culture or your legal system or even a family are dysfunctional, and it's going to steer people into having to make these difficult choices between some injustice or some other injustice. Not a perfect answer, but yeah. Let's think about another one. What about temperance? I mean, temperance has to do with your body and what you put into it and what you do with it and the pleasures that you take in certain things. And how is it, possible to go wrong? Well, eating too much, eating the wrong kind of things. I mean, you can have as much salad as you want, but you can't put ranch dressing on the salad all the time, right? If you're trying to lose weight. Or you can have a lot of little meals through the day, if that's, what floats your boat, but they probably shouldn't be 3,000 calories each. That would be intemperate. But why do people do that? Because food tastes good. And why do people like fatty foods? Fat makes food taste good, right? Sugar makes food taste good. If you go on a low-carb diet, have any of you ever done that? That low-carb stuff? You start to crave carbs, apparently. I don't do that sort of thing because I like carbs too much. Bread and pasta and potatoes, and that sort of thing. Now, that all has to do with you, and that's good. I mean, if you develop the virtue of temperance, great, I think that everybody should have it. Is it possible to think of the virtue of temperance in relation to other people? Should it govern, let's say we just take food, not sexual relations, because that one's pretty easy to think of how that has to do with other people, right? Just food. Are there reasons, are there situations in which your temperance would be in relation to others rather than just bearing on yourself? What about if you make your food choices based on where the food is coming from? Who's benefiting and who's being harmed by it? Like, coffee is a great example. They have all this fair trade coffee stuff. What's all that about? Any of you buy fair trade coffee or care about that? What's the idea behind that? Yeah.
Okay, people producing it, and people, what's called,
The farmers, yeah.
are getting fair payment for that.
What's usually the case?
Just because it's more fair than other things, it doesn't necessarily mean that conditions are good.
Well, yeah. I mean, being a farmer, even a fair trade farmer, doesn't mean you're rolling in the lap of agricultural luxury. But what were you going to say?
Well, like usually, even thinking about other foods, there's a movie about it.
Yeah, we have this whole food ethics movie series here. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it.
It expose, I think it's Tyson, and it would be all of the chicken farmers and stuff, and
Yeah.
they're not really farming, it's the actual company that doesn't do anything that's not in the offices and everything. They control everything that happens on a farm.
Yeah, they call that agribusiness. And you can find that with animal food production, with milk production, with grains, a lot of the fields are actually owned by these big corporations. Yeah, I mean, there could be an ethical dimension to what we're eating and drinking. If you're buying fair trade coffee, I don't know if it's guaranteed that all the profits are gonna go where they're supposed to go, but you're at least making an effort, right? You're exercising something. And that takes some motivation and that takes some habit forming to do, doesn't it? I mean, if your habit is, I'm gonna get coffee wherever it happens to be at the cheapest price, you're not gonna buy fair trade coffee. You're not gonna be concerned with that sort of thing. You actually have to go out of your way sometimes if you want to make food choices that would tie in with temperance understood in terms of justice, not just understood in terms of not putting on a lot of weight or restraining your own appetites. What about anger? Managing anger. Does that have any social dimensions? Or even not necessarily with society. What about in your family? Your own family? Or even your own relationship with, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, later on.
You can't like walk around screaming like a complete lunatic all the time. People, they're just not gonna. It's just
You
not
can for a short time.
You can, yeah, but you lose your mind for like a minute. But you can't like on an everyday interaction basis kind of thing. You can't do that. You have to have some sort of temperance to your anger specific. I mean, like your emotions, but like anger specifically in check. So like.
Yeah, although there are some people who get a lot more allowances made, and oftentimes in dysfunctional families, you'll see there'll be like one person who is the rageful person, and then everyone else kind of like stays in the periphery to avoid angering them. And Aristotle would say that's a bad situation. That's an unjust situation in which the lack of virtue of the one person with respect to their anger is actually affecting not just them, not just their relations with the other people, but the entire small community that is the family. And you could think about this with teams, you could think about this with classes, you could think about this with any sort of group that you're in. There's some need for us to cultivate at least some control of our anger, hopefully, becoming eventually what Aristotle calls mild or gentle or good-tempered people. Tough to do, too, especially at your age. But, it'll get better as time goes on, because that part of we've talked about this before, that part of your brain that's not completely finished growing yet, has to do with impulse control. By the time you're 25, your brain is actually finished growing. We now know this. You'll probably have some more degree of control over anger by that time. But only some. Most of it has to come through habit, right? It has to come through developing that virtue. Now, Aristotle also says something that's interesting about this idea of complete justice as well. He says, you can look at the motivation why people commit unjust actions. He uses adultery as an example. Let's expand it just so we'll call it sexual cheating, right? Because we don't talk that much about adultery in our society, but we do recognize that if you're in a monogamous relationship and you're committed, it's wrong for you to cheat, right? It's wrong for your partner to cheat on you. It's wrong for somebody else to come in from the outside and try to seduce you or your partner. It'd be wrong for you to give in to that. It's wrong for you to go and seduce somebody else out of a monogamous relationship. We do recognize that as a norm in our society, right? Whether it's marriages or boyfriends, girlfriends, we get upset about that. What are the motivations that people could do? What sort of characters would you show? He talks about somebody who commits adultery or sexual cheating, and they do so motivated primarily by sexual pleasure. They can't stay with their partner because they want more pleasure than their partner is giving them, or a different kind of pleasure, or who knows what else. They actually are willing to lose some of their resources in order to do that. We would say that person is actually motivated by the vice of intemperance. That they have we would say a problem, right? And that's that kind of vice. What if they do it for money? What if they do it just for gain? Or what if they do it, well, we could think of other cases. Why else do people cheat? If it's not just to enjoy sexual pleasure, what's probably another one of the bigger reasons why unhappy, you said? In what way?
They don't like their current, I guess, relationship, and they're just looking to see if there's anything better out there.
Again, that would be the trying to seek pleasure part, right? I'm not getting enough pleasure out of it, so I'm going to find pleasure elsewhere. Sometimes they do it to hurt the other person, right? I think that's probably the second biggest reason. You know, it could be they cheated on me. I don't like the way they're handling our finances. They didn't live up to, you know, promises that they made about going on, you know, this or that. I'm going to show them. And people do that, don't they? I mean, this is what makes Jerry Springer, other shows like that. That would be acting out of anger, I think. What if you did it just for the money? Or just to get something else monetary out of it? Well, that would be injustice, Aristotle says. It's possible to be unjust in doing certain intemperate actions, or certain angry actions, or certain other actions. What about somebody who turns their back on the people that they're supposed to defend? A cop who isn't courageous when they're supposed to be and leaves people at the mercy of criminals because he or she is paid off. Are they just a coward, or are they actually unjust? Aristotle would say they're unjust. If they left people at the mercy of the criminals because they were too scared to get in there and stand up for them, they would be a coward. But if they're actually doing it because they were bribed and they're staying out of that area, then they would be unjust. So that's probably enough about that. Let's look now at some of the particular forms of justice that Aristotle talks about. Getting beyond legal justice, there's what Aristotle calls particular justice. And he talks about three different types of particular justice. He talks about distributive justice, and this could be part of the legal system, but sometimes isn't. Then there's what he calls rectificatory justice. Again, sometimes part of the legal system, you know, sentencing, the whole criminal procedure would fit into this. And then there's what he calls reciprocity. And just to give you sort of a thumbnail sketch, distributive justice has to do with how we allocate good and bad things among people or within relationships. Rectificatory justice, it comes from the word meaning to set things right. So when things have actually gotten screwed up, somebody's gotten too much, somebody's gotten too little, then justice means setting those things straight. And then reciprocity is giving back to another what you're getting, or something comparable to it. It could be good, you know, somebody takes you out for lunch, you reciprocate by taking them out for lunch as well, or by providing them, you know, a nice print of something that they like, or sending them a thank you card that's reciprocating. A thank you card probably not as much, right? If they do something bad, you know, an example of reciprocating, somebody smacks you, you smack them. That's reciprocity, right? Now, in all of these, there's another set of terms that are important, or a set of concepts that are important to bring up. And these are equality, or fairness, and proportionality. Sometimes things should be equal. Everything should be, you know, in the middle. That's the mean. Everybody getting the same amount. Sometimes it's not strict equality. Sometimes it's what he calls proportionality, so that everybody gets what they deserve according to some sort of criteria. Not something irrational, like, well, I'm taller than all of you, so I should get more respect than all of you. That would be an irrational type of inequality. Proportionality is always going to be unequal, but the question is there a good reason for why there's an inequality? So let's start with distributive justice. Let's look at that first. Distributive justice has to do with good and bad things and allotting them within, context of, say, personal relationships, groups, society as a whole. How do you distribute those sort of things? First, let's think about what sort of things we're talking about. What are the kind of good and bad things that you can divide up and proportion out to people that you can share? What's that?
Taxes.
Taxes is a bad thing, right?
Well.
It's good for the government. It's good for those who are benefiting from it, but we all tend to look at it as a loss on our part, right? And you're right, yeah, taxes can be apportioned fairly or unfairly. There's all these proposals of having altered forms of the tax system, like some sort of flat tax. Which things you're going to tax? Do you tax consumption, basic consumption items that everyone has to buy? Do you tax luxury items? How much of your income should go in taxes? Those are all real questions. So actually, let's focus on bad things first then. What are other bad things that could be fairly or unfairly allotted to people or spread out or...
Jury duty.
Yeah, that's a good example.
I would hope.
I never have to do jury duty myself, incidentally, because as soon as they find out I'm a college professor, and then I teach ethics, or back in the day I used to teach critical thinking, I'm out of there immediately. They don't want somebody like me on. Neither the defense nor the prosecutor. Yeah.
In my class before this, I take criminal procedure too, and we're just talking about jury duty and the selection of the juries. It's pretty funny how the reasons that they don't want people and stuff like that, and if it's like a drug case, my teacher that was a prosecutor would want moms with children and Girl Scout leaders and things like that, just people that are that have that I don't know.
Wholesome.
People that you can rely on to decide the way that you would like them to decide. The reason why somebody like me would get rejected is because they would have no idea how I would decide, but they would worry that I would tilt the jury one way or the other. So you're not going to see a lot of college professors on juries. Oftentimes we talk about this issue of a jury of one's peers, and sometimes they'll try to balance the jury as far as race or gender, socioeconomic class, those sorts of things. What else? So we have jury duty, taxes. You guys are in a sort of governmental mood today. What are other things that we can distribute that are bad things? How about work? What? Yeah, if you like the work, then it's not bad. Let me put it to you this way. Why do most students not like doing group projects?
Oh.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I just like to be responsible for my own grade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite statements, professors to go, this is what it's going to be like in the real world. And I'm like, no, they get fired in the real world if they don't do their
Sometimes
job.
they do. Sometimes people who don't do work, in gold brick or they manage to hang on. Yeah.
I think the biggest difference between real world and classes. Real world, you're all working for the same company. You're there every day. Here, you're working around 4 other people's college schedule and their extracurricular activities and just their effort or lack thereof effort. So
Yeah, that's
there's a lot more components than the real world has to offer.
Well, what is the biggest problem with group work other than coordination? That is an issue. Yeah.
You have some groups who have all effective team members. Obviously, they're gonna work better together and get a better grade. And then what if you just randomly get stuck with idiots and you end up doing all the work and even at the end of the day, if you're doing all the work, you still can't amount to 4 people all putting in effort compared to your team of just you putting in effort.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's you put your finger right on the problem. There's 2 main ways things could go bad. One, you could just get saddled with a bunch of people who have no idea what they're doing. But usually, what's that a result of? Well, they don't read the text at all. They don't pay attention in class. They could actually be, genuinely dull people, right? But that's, more often, they're the ones that, and then here we get to the second type, they expect everybody else to do the work, right? If you put people into a group and you say, okay, here's the assignment, we need to do this, a lot of times people just sort of look at each other at first, and then after an uncomfortable silence, somebody will take charge. And there's a lot of people who are, they're willing to sit back and let somebody else take charge, right? Let's see where this goes. Maybe I won't have to do anything. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say, last semester for my business class, I'm sure everybody has to take organizational behavior, I think it is.
Yeah.
It's all.
The heck is that?
Your phone.
That's really weird.
Typical 13.
Yeah. I didn't even know I had a phone in here. Go ahead with what you're
It's
saying.
like the whole class is like a group project, and I had these two boys in my group who did nothing. We had mandatory meetings, we had to have a certain number of meetings. They never came. They didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Me and these two other kids did the whole project, and I asked them what they got, and they got A's in the class. And I was
No, that strikes you as unfair,
They
right?
did nothing.
Yeah, all of you I think all of you probably have stories like that, right? If not from Marist, at least from high school or middle school or things along those lines. How do professors get around that? If a professor actually wants to be fair, what's the best thing for them to do if they're going to assign group work? Yeah.
You can give them each individual goals, so they're graded individually based on their own performance within the group.
There's that. Even going beyond that, if you really want to do group work well, you know what you do? You solicit feedback from the members of the group who put in which amount of work. And it quickly pans out, you figure out who actually did the project and who didn't. Yeah.
Right now I'm doing a packaging project for a graphic design, and I have to do to design everything, the logo. And I'm in a group where two kids, I'm basically the leader,
Yeah.
and I'm telling them what to do, and they have no ideas. But we're working in class and the teacher sees. And
Oh,
she'll
yeah,
tell
that
all
works
of
too,
us
yeah.
that if they're not doing anything, to tell her. And of course, I don't want to say that they're not doing anything, because one kid smokes at the class and then doesn't come back and leaves when we're going to talk about a meeting.
Yeah.
And so she knows that I'm doing everything, and she'll just come to me and be like, I know you're doing everything. So
That's good.
they're going to
That's good. And
Now that's a sign of somebody who is enacting what Aristotle would call distributive justice. You should get the better grade. Those who put in the work should actually get the rewards from it. Those who don't do anything shouldn't get any sort of reward, right? And so sometimes you need to have processes by which you can actually figure out how to proportion it out. So a bad way of doing group work is to just assign group projects, everybody gets the same grade, and you only look at the end product of it. If you're a professor, that's not a good way of assessing it, because it's not in line with distributive justice. Another thing that you can distribute that we ought to think about is risks or danger. If, for example, we send all of our trash and pollution and stuff like that off to some other group of people because they happen to be poor, that would be putting them at great risk, right, compared to us. Probably would violate the norms of distributive justice as far as our society goes. I know New York jokes a lot about New Jersey, where New York sends all of its garbage. I don't know if that's actually true. If that was indeed the case, that strikes me as kind of unfair, because it puts New Jersey residents at greater risk in some ways. If there's other things that we're involved with, and it puts some people at risk of, say, losing their houses or losing their livelihoods, and other people aren't going to be affected at all, maybe distributive justice would say there ought to be a corresponding reward for those people, something proportionate. Now, what about good things that we can distribute? What are some of the good things that we can portion out?
Well,
What's that?
well,
Yeah, that's a big one. Should, for example, a doctor get paid more for their work than an unskilled laborer stacking engine parts on pallets in a factory. Why?
They save lives. They save.
That's pretty important. They save lives, yeah. That's a very big function. I mean, conceivably, if the person stacks, no, there's no way to make it. I was just joking. Yeah, I mean, there's other people who might save lives who we might also say shouldn't get paid as much as the doctors. You know, police and firefighters in some places don't get paid enough, I think. It really depends on how good their union is usually. Maybe they should get paid more, but probably not as much as doctors. Why not? What else is relevant there? What has the doctor done? Yeah.
Years of medical school and training.
Yeah, they had to put themselves through well, yeah, 4 years of undergraduate, and then how long is med school?
4.
Another 4 years,
Then
and
you
then
do residency and that.
that's 3 years, right?
Yeah.
3 years of
degree.
residency. So that's 11 years, as opposed to maybe 4 years or no years of post-secondary ed. How much debt do doctors usually come out with? Any guesses? It's not small. Yeah, it's usually in the hundreds of thousands. But you know, in part because med school costs quite a bit of money. And, so yeah, there's probably a good argument for the doctor getting paid more for their services. And we can do this with a lot of different professions. Maybe there's some professions that are paid too much, you know, in our society. Maybe there's others that aren't paid enough. We would have to make some sort of reasoned argument for why they ought to get paid more and paid less if we want it to be in line with distributive justice. What else can we give besides wealth or income? What else can we share out? Candy. If I bring in candy, should I give? Should I just throw it at random like they do in parades? Just come in and throw it in the air, and whoever catches one. What if I only throw it over at this side? That's not very fair. You get candy, but they wouldn't. Well, you could rectify it. You could fix that. Yeah. What if I come in and I say, okay, everybody who's wearing light colors gets 5 candy bars. Everybody who's wearing dark colors, we'd probably get into an argument about what
is
level
light
of
and
gray. Everybody who's wearing dark colors gets 1 candy bar. Anybody who contests it gets no candy bars. Would that be fair? It'd be a rather irrational way of dividing up candy bars, wouldn't it? Yeah.
In regards to distribution, sorry to sway away from your topic, I do
No,
think
it's okay.
it is irrational. Maybe like distribution of knowledge is a good thing, meaning everybody equally gets a chance to go to school and learn.
Now you're actually, you're not going away from the topic, because that has to do with equality of opportunity.
Okay.
One of the things that we think is very important is that at least in our society, and societies like ours, is that everybody has the chance to be able to do something. It doesn't mean that they'll automatically succeed and that we have to bankroll them until they actually do succeed, particularly if they're never going to. But to be allowed entrance into a field, into a place, to have the same opportunities as everybody else. We look at that as, we tend to look at that as something that ought to be equal, not just proportional. Although, when it comes down to getting more selective, should everybody who applies to med school be allowed to go to med school? They reject some applications. Should people who have a crazily off-base assessment of their own skills, academic skills, be allowed to go to med school? Probably not. I hope not.
Well, you never know when you get the D doctor or the C doctor.
Yeah, well, you know that old joke, right? What do you call the person who graduated last in medical school?
That thing.
Yeah, so, just because they have the diploma on the wall doesn't mean that they were the best in their class. What about affection or attention? Do you think that could be a matter of fairness or justice? Not within society. I'm not saying that we all have to be affectionate with each other or anything like that. What about within your family? Let's say you have kids. It will probably be tempting to apportion the affection unevenly. Some kids are, quite frankly, more of a pain than other kids. Maybe you want to give them less affection. That's almost a natural thing, isn't it? We like people who aren't easy to get along with. Would that be fair, though, if you're a parent? Or what about time? I brought up an example in the other class. Somebody says, I'm sorry, little Susie, I can't go to your dance recital because this week I've gone to little Tommy's soccer game and Cub Scout meeting and tuba recital. That would strike us as very unfair, wouldn't it? To say, no, I can't go to your one event because I'm going to spend all my time going to this other event? Yeah.
We went over this topic a few weeks ago about having a child with like a disability.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to give them more time.
Yeah, and that would be a question of proportionality. There you would have a legitimate reason to give one more than the other. They have greater needs. I like this kid more and this kid less. That wouldn't be a good reason for proportioning that different. Parents do that, though, don't they? Sometimes. We do that with friends, too, don't we? Who are we going to hang out with? Who are we going to stay in touch with? A lot of these things come down to distributive justice, in a way. Let's go on to rectificatory justice. So rectificatory justice, that's a hard word to keep saying right, so I'm not going to say it much more because I'll start tripping over it. It means setting things right. So think of it this way. When somebody has wronged another person, when injustice has been committed, somebody's gotten too much, somebody's gotten too little. So if we're thinking in terms of the balance of justice with scales, the balance has been shifted, and now it has to be brought back. And there's a lot of ways in which this can occur, because there's a lot of different goods and bads, bless you, that could be experienced. I think it's useful the way that Aristotle actually distinguishes the different kinds of cases. He talks about voluntary transactions or relations, like business connections, like you go into the workplace, you don't have to be in the workplace. Nobody's like chaining you to your desk. If they do, then you've got a pretty good case, I think, in this society. I think that some of the other things that would fit into that as well would probably be personal relationships, like friendships, a marriage. You could probably also say things like sports teams or clubs that people are involved with. Or good examples. I forgot to bring up the student housing example for the distributive. So I'll talk about housing with respect to rectificatory justice. Actually, let's start with that. How many of you have lived in the dorms at one time or another? Practically all of you. What are your big complaints about living in the dorms? Yeah.
Sharing a bathroom with like 25 girls that like go out on the weekends and the bathroom doesn't get clean sometimes.
Okay, so that's actually a really good example of the bathroom's a common space, right? Everybody has to use it. They don't get cleaned on the weekends. Some kids go out, they come back, bathroom's a mess. All different, I don't have to go into details, you've all seen messy bathrooms, right? In a way, they're doing something wrong. They're taking more than their fair share of the public space, and they're leaving it in a bad condition after they're done with it. Rectificatory justice, I mean, one way to set that right would maybe be make them go in and clean it up. They probably don't allow you to make the kids do that, do they?
I live in an upperclassman area, so I don't have
An
to.
upperclassman never do anything like that.
Well, like Mark's my resident, and like he
Yeah.
would only clean them really in his house.
I really am, it's sad. Out of 8 guys, there's only 1 person. Well,
That's terrible.
Yeah, and like I'll go in for like inspection at the end of the semester, and I'm like, this bathroom is disgusting. Like you guys live all together, and like you go into Mark's room and everything is like neatly placed, and then everyone else has like a mess.
It must be an unpleasant bathroom for you then.
Yeah, most of the time.
Maybe, you know, I mean, what would set it right would be those guys ought to go in and clean it up.
Good
You
one,
know?
good one.
Well, we're talking about
I've tried.
We're talking about what ought to happen, not
Yeah.
necessarily what you can actually get people to do. Yeah.
The common area where I live, right now, I woke up to like a lot of like, people put like cups all over the place from playing beer pong last night.
Yeah.
Like, they're gonna clean it up obviously, but like last semester, there was a girl who I lived with where the room was more messy than usual.
Yeah.
We all left it for them to do it, clean it up, but that one girl, she couldn't stand, so she cleaned everything up and we got mad at her.
Yeah, well, you know, okay, so that's an interesting story. Somebody else comes along and cleans up somebody else's mess.
Yeah, even though she was supposed to.
Well, yeah, because they're not balancing things out by fixing that, in part because what's going on with this, somebody has gotten more than their fair share. And that somebody ought to be somehow, you know, lowered or have less of that, and other people ought to have more. So if somebody else comes along and does the work for cleaning it up for her, she's not actually, you know, giving back her share. You know, another way might be like fining people. And I'm not saying that all these work in the dorms. One of the things that's probably the worst about the dorms is how little actually does get done. I remember when I was in the dorms, the biggest problem that I had was with noise. I mean, the people, the dorm walls were always really thin, so there'd always be some dummy who came home at 2 in the morning and blasted their stereo. You know? And you know, what are they doing there? They're in a way taking more than their fair share of something, of time, of quiet, of, you know,
I
common
remember
space.
my freshman year, like every night this one kid was like a sprint down the hall every night.
Was it part of his exercise routine?
I don't know, it was just every night he was sprinting down the hall.
Wow.
I don't know. Like,
Nobody
I
had
opened
that.
my door, like he'd be gone, but I like, who the hell was just running down the hall every night?
What time? Was it real late that
It
he
was
did it?
like 2 or 3 in the morning, just like sprinting down the hall.
Wow. Maybe he had some sort of strange obsession. You know?
Cocaine.
What's that?
Nothing,
Cocaine?
I was just-
Cocaine can become an obsession. That would be an obsession that provokes other obsessions. I mean, you guys could probably, we could do like a whole class period just on problems with the dorms, right? And how rectificatory justice should come in. Let's think about this with some other frameworks like this. You know, what are some of the too much, too little that would come in, say, with a marriage, where one partner would get too much and one partner would get too little? What are the sort of things that could be evened out? Yeah.
I'm actually going through this right now, and it's just, I don't know, it's just little stupid things like furniture and choices like that. And
Oh, who gets to pick which
and
things?
yeah, and it's just
Yeah.
like, there's not enough compromise, so it's like driving me nuts kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that would be a good example.
Who makes decisions, and it's not just that stuff, it's like bigger decisions too, like where we live, or,
Well, those are big, or finances. Or,
yeah, it's just like who makes decisions more.
I guess that would be like sharing power or decision-making capability in the relationship. And yeah, that, you know, that could be off balance, and then maybe somebody, if they're going to have it be off balance, maybe they should have to make up for it in some other way. You know? What about like housework? One of the common complaints is who tends not to do enough housework in a marriage? Still today. What's that?
Men, usually.
Yeah. You know, and
I think it works out though, because a lot of times, like you guys are, like, I don't know, I think that you should be responsible for
yeah.
outside stuff that's like heavier and like kind of more, like, but I think it works out in that way.
I agree with that.
Depends on how big your yard is.
Unfortunately, not everybody looks at it that way.
Your generation is better for this than my generation was at your time. And my generation is way better than the previous generation. It was very unbalanced. But the sociologists have studied this, and it is still somewhat unbalanced, the amount of hours that are put in doing it. Maybe there's some need for fairness in that. Maybe somebody's getting too much and somebody's getting too little. There are all sorts of things we could think about in terms of this. Let's go on to reciprocity then. So what is reciprocity? I said it was giving back what you're getting. And Aristotle points out something really interesting, which is, as human beings, we naturally want to be able to do. When somebody hurts us, we talked about this with anger, we would like for them to get hurt too, or we would like to see somebody else hurt them. Right? That's what we see as reciprocity, that old notion of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That is something that's very strong in us. There's a sort of naive conception of justice associated with that. That could be at odds with some of these other kinds of justice. There could be times when an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is really not what is going to set things right in a good way. Just going to perpetuate, So maybe somebody strikes me and breaks my jaw. Maybe I don't get to go and break their jaw, or have somebody else go break their jaw while I'm recovering. Maybe they have to pay for my hospital stay and pay me some damages and pay for the lost wages. That would be rectificatory justice as opposed to reciprocity. When it comes to good things, we want to be able to reciprocate, and we often feel ourselves hindered if we can't do that too. You've all heard of the notion of poetic justice, right? Well, what is poetic justice? Let me say that that's poetic justice. Somebody's gotten poetic justice. It's usually when, yeah, go ahead.
Usually when they're like something that they're usually complaining about happens to them. Or like, I'm trying to think of it. That's a poor way to describe it. Like,
something that they've done to other people.
Done to other people, they're finally
like for example,
for doing it.
somebody who cheats on their boyfriends or girlfriends continually.
And then they get cheated.
Yeah, and in a really big way, some way that like devastates them. Movies are made out of this sort of stuff, right? When we see it, we're like, yeah, okay, that seems fair. That seems appropriate. We feel kind of a sense that things have been, put back to the way they should be. It's not quite the same thing as rectificatory justice. It's something, in some ways, a bit more primitive, isn't it? Yeah.
Karma? It's like karma, right?
The notion of karma, in the full sense, like we're talking about like Buddhism or Hinduism, where the good or bad consequences of one's actions attach to one's person and continue with them, and then bring upon them things in return. Yeah, that would be a lot like reciprocity, I think. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Aren't we saying that then if we agree that somebody who cheated a lot on somebody else and that they get cheated on is okay, when we're saying that was unjust, so it's okay if this person's unjust because they're a super unjust person, that wouldn't be the right thing. The right thing would be for them to get branded as a person who cheats and nobody wants to go ahead and date them or have anything to do with them.
Yeah, I think that would be, somebody like Aristotle would say that would be the more just.
Right.
Because reciprocity does capture some aspect of justice, just like legal justice captures some aspect, but it doesn't capture the fullness of it. I think what you're suggesting would actually be in some ways more just. He also talks about the importance of reciprocity in the social bond in connecting us up with each other. And there it much less involves equality, much more involves proportionality. Economic exchange, as such, is a matter of reciprocity. What do we feel is a fair price for something when we're getting equal value for what we're giving, right? And this doesn't necessarily have to be goods, it could also be services. Let's say you're swapping services. Somebody's going to come and clean your yard up. You know, you could pay them money, or you could cook them dinner, right? That could be a matter of reciprocity. They might actually say, your dinner's not that good. I'm not going to clean your yard for that because your yard's 5 acres, you know. Or maybe your dinner's really good, and they'll say, I'll do your yard twice for that. It's a matter of finding the sort of equality point, and it's not strict equality, it's proportionality. He's got this example of like the shoemaker who trades 5 pairs of shoes for 1 pet. I don't think that's very easy for us to relate to, right? Although actually it probably would be about the same. You know, if you have fancy shoes, it would probably be about the same amount of money for that these days. I think there's a lot of other things that we could think of instead. What are trade-offs that you make in your life with people? As students, do you help anybody study? Do they give you anything back for that? I hope they do. At least, you know, praise. You're a good person for helping me out like this. That's the cheapest coin available. Maybe if you help somebody write their paper, they should take you out for dinner. You don't know about that? Well, what should they do? I mean, that's one of those things where you'd have to think about what would be a fair exchange. The last type of justice that he talks about, we're not going to go very far into this, is what he calls equity. In Greek, it's epieikeia. And this is a different type of fairness. It's something that modifies legal justice. One of the problems that we saw with legal justice is a person can follow the law without really being just inside. And sometimes if the laws are set up certain ways, they can be a bit rigid, can't they? Can you think of any examples in our society of laws that are somewhat unduly, rigid in how they treat people, so sometimes injustices take place by following the laws? Any ideas? Yeah.
Well, I don't know if this applies, you can tell me after, but there's like there's different penalty for like powdered cocaine and then solid cocaine.
Oh, yeah.
Where
the penalties for
powdered is more.
No, it's less.
You're right, it's less. But for solid, it's more. And
Yeah.
like the people that can buy the type that's less punishable are like typically like white males,
well, not necessarily that, but certainly rich.
But rich people, yeah.
Cocaine costs a lot of money.
Yeah, and then
Crack doesn't.
yeah,
That's why so many more people use crack.
and then the people that are a little less off get like higher penalties.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see that as unjust, unfair. They're not saying that everybody should get to do whatever drugs they want all the time. They're saying there's some unfairness in the way sentencing is being done. Or you could think about some of the 3 strikes in your outlaws, where the 3rd strike could be pretty minor infraction, and you're going to jail for life. Equity is a modification of legal justice that tempers it, that says, well, in this case, not in every single case, but in this case, we should lessen it. We should be more flexible. Aristotle compares it to this type of ruler that they used, which was made out of lead. And so if you wanted to measure things that weren't perfectly straight, you would bend the ruler. Equity is like that compared to the straight, wooden ruler of the law. So he says all law is universal, but about some things it's not possible to make a universal statement which shall be correct. When the law speaks universally and a case arises on it which is not covered by the universal statement, it's right to correct the omission, to say what the legislator would have said. So you look to what the spirit of the law is. What was the purpose behind the law? This goes to what you were saying, excuse me, at the beginning of the class about understanding what the law is there for. What's the good that it's supposed to serve. This becomes really important in things like family law, or some areas of civil law, where there's a lot of need for equity, or I think in terms that we would more often use today, we would call this discretion. Those of you who are in fields that, say business or criminal justice, where you use this term, that's what Aristotle is calling equity here. So that's also a type of justice. So now we've looked at a bunch of different forms, and you notice that if we want to understand justice as a whole, we have to put all of these together. So that's where we'll leave off. Have a good weekend. I won't see you Tuesday.